A clay tablet from the city of Nibiru, dated roughly to the 3rd millennium BCE, holds a list of kings who ruled before a great flood. Their reigns stretch across tens of thousands of years, numbers so large that scholars have debated them for over a century. Some dismiss them as symbolic, others see exaggeration layered over faded memory. But one detail sits quietly beneath the argument the list doesn't begin on Earth. It begins somewhere above it, in a place the scribes connected to the origins of kingship and some believe to a wandering world later remembered as Nibiru. What exactly were they trying not to forget tonight? We're settling into that question, not to answer it, but to follow where it leads. The idea that humanity might have left behind another world, that Nibiru was not simply a myth, but a fading echo of somewhere real, has drifted through ancient texts for thousands of years. It surfaces in Sumerian hymns, in Akkadian star catalogues, in Babylonian creation stories, and in symbols carved across civilizations that never shared a border. We'll move through several layers tonight. First, the traces left in stone alignments and architectures that seem to carry memories older than the cultures that built them. Then the patterns, sudden leaps in knowledge, symbols repeated across oceans, origin myths that point not downward toward the soil, but upward toward the sky. And finally the silence, the long quiet that followed, when those who may have walked among early humans disappeared from the record, leaving behind questions that still have no comfortable answers. Before we reach any of that, though, it helps to sit with something simple. Imagine standing in southern Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago. The air is warm and still. The light from a low sun stretches long across a flat plain cut by rivers. Somewhere nearby, a settlement is beginning to take the shape of something no one has quite seen before. Streets laid in deliberate patterns, walls built from mud brick with a consistency that suggests planning, and at the centre a structure rising higher than anything around it, oriented not toward a neighbouring village or a trade route, but toward a point in the sky. That structure, a ziggurat in its earliest form, was not simply a temple. It was a direction. It pointed upward, the way a compass points north with purpose, with insistence, as if the builders believed that the most important thing in their world was not on the ground, but somewhere above it. The warmth of the plain, the weight of the bricks in their hands, these were immediate, tangible. But the orientation of the building suggested they were reaching for something they could no longer touch. This pattern building toward the sky appears not only in Mesopotamia, it appears in Egypt, where the Great Pyramid's internal shafts align with Orion and Sirius. It appears at Teotihuacan, where the city grid follows the position of the Pleiades. It appears at Göbekli Tepe, where carved pillars from nearly 12,000 years ago track the rising of specific stars built by people who had not yet developed agriculture. And it appears in the Andes, where Cusco and Machu Picchu mirror solar and stellar movements with a precision that still puzzles engineers. These are not small coincidences. They are choices made by people who treated the sky as something personal, not just a calendar, not just a source of light, but a reference point for identity. As though they were preserving a connection to a place they could no longer visit. Here is where a quiet number enters the picture. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, takes roughly 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. It's not something a single generation could observe. It would take centuries of careful, consistent record-keeping to even detect the drift. Yet structures in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley appear to account for it aligned with star positions that match skies from thousands of years before those civilizations officially began. Some researchers suggest inherited knowledge. Others see coincidence. Neither explanation settles the question entirely. The Sumerian king list. The same tablet from Nippur offers another thread. It records rulers whose reigns span thousands of years, then gradually shorten as the list approaches historical periods. Read one way, it is simply mythological inflation. Read another, it might preserve a fading memory of beings whose lifespans or whose sense of time operated on a different scale. Beings who measured existence not in decades but in orbital returns, the kind of long sweeping cycles that a world like Nibiru, if it existed, would demand of anyone living on it. Ancient texts from the same region describe these figures not as abstract gods but as travellers. People who descended, who taught, who shaped early communities and then eventually withdrew, The word Anunnaki itself has been translated in various ways, but one recurring thread is the idea of those who came from the sky to the earth, not as light or spirit, but as presence, as people who carried tools, who worked metal, who understood the movements of stars from an angle unfamiliar to anyone born on this planet. What makes these stories unusual is not their content alone. Many cultures describe sky beings, but their specificity. They name locations. They describe mining operations in a region called the Abzu. They reference gold not as currency or decoration, but as a material with a functional purpose tied to atmospheric stability. They describe a world whose environment was failing, whose inhabitants needed resources Earth could provide. Whether any of this reflects actual events or simply the elaborate imagination of early scribes is a question that remains open. But the detail is striking for texts composed thousands of years before atmospheric engineering existed as a concept. And then there are the echoes that sit outside any single text. The winged disc appearing in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, and Central America. The motif of a radiant figure surrounded by light found in Sumer, India, and across the Mediterranean. Origin myths on every inhabited continent that describe humanity not as something that grew from the ground, but as something that arrived, was shaped, was given breath by visitors who eventually returned to the sky. These parallels do not prove a shared origin, but they form a pattern, faint, persistent, and remarkably consistent across cultures that had no known way of speaking to one another. Tonight we are not here to resolve that pattern. We are here to follow it slowly without rushing toward conclusions, to sit with the stones, the symbols, the alignments, and the silence, and to let them speak in whatever quiet voice they still carry. So let us begin where the oldest records point toward a sky that ancient people did not simply admire but remembered. The record before the record. In the low light of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, behind a case of temperature-controlled glass, there sits a small clay prism no taller than a man's hand. It is cracked along one edge. The surface is covered in columns of cuneiform so fine that a magnifying lens is needed to read the individual wedge marks. This object, known as the Weld Blundell Prism, was excavated in 1922 from the ancient site of Lhasa, and it contains what scholars consider the most complete surviving copy of the Sumerian king list, a record that begins not with human rulers but with the kingship itself descending from the sky. The list is methodical. It names cities, it names rulers, it assigns reign lengths, and for the earliest entries those reign lengths stretch into figures so vast they seem to belong to a different kind of time altogether. One king is said to have ruled for 43,200 years, another for 28,800. The numbers do not fluctuate randomly, they follow patterns based on a sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics that Sumerians used for everything from commerce to astronomy. That mathematical consistency is what makes the list difficult to dismiss as pure fantasy. Whatever the scribes were recording, they were recording it with structure. Most historians treat the earliest portions of the king list as mythological or a symbolic preamble to the historical dynasties that follow, and there are strong reasons for that reading. The reign lengths are biologically impossible for any known species. The cities named in the antediluvian section, cities like Eridu, Bad Tabira, and Sippar, are real places with confirmed archaeological layers, but no physical evidence has been found linking them to rulers who governed for millennia. The simplest explanation is that the scribes were preserving a cultural origin story, not a literal timeline. But the list carries a detail that invites a second look. It does not describe these early kings as gods. It does not use the language of divine hymns or temple liturgy. It treats them as administrators' figures who held power, transferred it, and eventually lost it when a flood disrupted the sequence. After the flood, the reign lengths dropped dramatically. They shortened from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, then to decades. The transition reads less like a shift from myth to history, and more like a change in the kind of beings who held authority. As though something about the rulers themselves had changed, or as though the people recording the list remembered a time when leadership operated on a scale they could no longer fully explain. This is where the idea of Nibiru begins to breathe inside the oldest surviving records, not as a dramatic claim or a sensational theory, but as a quiet possibility folded into the margins of texts that scholars have studied for over a century. The word itself appears in Babylonian astronomical texts, most notably in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, where it is associated with a celestial body linked to the god Marduk. In those texts, Nibiru is described as a crossing point, a place where paths intersect, where one region of the sky meets another. Some translators read it as a reference to Jupiter, others associate it with a fixed star. A smaller group beginning most prominently with Zecharia Sitchin in the 1970s proposed that Nibiru referred to an undiscovered planet with a long elliptical orbit, a world that periodically passed through the inner solar system before retreating into the cold distances beyond Neptune. Sitchin's interpretation has been widely criticized by Assyriologists and astronomers alike. His translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts diverge significantly from academic consensus, and no telescope has confirmed the existence of a large planet on the kind of orbit he described. These are valid objections, and they deserve to sit alongside the idea rather than beneath it. But what Sitchin did, whether his linguistic methods were sound or not, was draw attention to a pattern that existed long before he wrote about it, the pattern of ancient civilizations describing their origins as arriving from somewhere beyond Earth, and associating that origin with a specific region of the sky. The Sumerians did not invent this idea in isolation. Their neighbours, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, carried up variations of the same framework. Beings descended. They brought knowledge. They organised early communities. They eventually withdrew or were separated from humanity by a catastrophic event, usually a flood. The details shift from culture to culture, but the architecture of the story remains remarkably stable across centuries of retelling, and it is always tied in one form or another to the sky. What makes the Sumerian version distinctive is its specificity. These are not vague references to heaven or abstract divine realms. The texts name locations. They describe tasks including mining, agriculture, and construction. They reference materials. They speak of labour, of weariness, of conflict among the beings themselves over how to manage the work required to sustain their presence on Earth. The Atrahasis epic. One of the oldest Mesopotamian narratives describes a moment when the lesser beings among the visitors rebelled against the burden of physical labour, leading to the creation of humanity as a workforce. Clay and blood mixed together shaped into something new. Read through a purely literary lens, these are origin myths, elegant, layered, and rich with metaphor. Read through the lens of inherited memory, they become something else. A record compressed and distorted by time of events that the people writing them down no longer fully understood but refused to let go of entirely. The clay prism in Baghdad does not answer the question of whether Nibiru was real. It does not confirm or deny that humanity's earliest rulers came from another world, but it preserves a pattern kingship descending knowledge arriving time, measured in scales that do not belong to ordinary human experience, and that pattern, quiet as it is, has not stopped pulling at the edges of what we think we know. It is from that pattern carried forward through tablets, temples, and the slow erosion of memory that the next layer of the story begins to take shape in the places where the earliest cities were built, and in the alignments those cities carried toward a sky their builders seemed unwilling to forget. Cities built towards something they could not name. At the southern edge of modern Iraq, roughly 15 kilometers southwest of the city of Nasiriyah, the remains of Eridu rise barely above the level of the surrounding desert. The mounds are modest, low-wind smoothed ridges of compacted sand and collapsed mud brick that give little indication of what lies beneath. But excavations carried out across the 20th century revealed something that changed the way scholars understood the origins of urban life in Mesopotamia. Beneath the sand lay 18 distinct layers of construction, each built directly on top of the one before stretching back to approximately 5,400 BCE. The earliest layer was a small structure no larger than a modest room, with a niche set into one wall and a platform that appeared to serve as an offering table. Over the centuries that followed, each successive community built a larger version of the same structure on the same spot, preserving the orientation, expanding the footprint and raising the height, until the final form became one of the earliest known ziggurats in human history. What is striking is not only the age of the site, but the consistency of direction. Every layer faced the same way. Every expansion followed the same axis. The builders were not simply constructing shelter or storage. They were maintaining an alignment that mattered enough to preserve across nearly 3,000 years of continuous habitation. Eridu is traditionally regarded in Sumerian literary tradition as the first city, the place where kingship first descended from the heavens, according to the king list discussed earlier. Whether or not that tradition reflects a literal event, the archaeological record supports the idea that Eridu held a special status among the earliest settled communities of southern Mesopotamia. Its temple sequence is among the oldest known continuous religious structures anywhere in the world, and its position in the landscape was not chosen for obvious practical advantages. It did not sit at the junction of major rivers. It did not occupy elevated ground. It sat at the edge of a freshwater marsh, close to the point where the waters of the Euphrates spread into wetlands before reaching the sea. The choice of location suggests that proximity to water mattered, but so did something else. Something connected to the symbolic or directional significance of the site itself. Some researchers have noted that the orientation of Eridu's temple layers corresponds to celestial markers, though the exact alignment has been debated. What is not debated is the intention. These were not random constructions. They were deliberate, repeated, and carried forward with a discipline that implies inherited instruction. As centuries passed, the pattern established at Eridu spread. Other cities rose across the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, Uruk-ur-Lagash-Nippur, and each carried its own version of the elevated temple complex oriented toward the sky. Uruk, which by the 4th millennium BCE had grown into one of the largest cities in the world, contained the Ayan, a precinct, a massive temple complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna. The layout of Inanna was not incidental. Its walls, courtyards, and central platforms followed alignments that reflected careful observation of celestial events, particularly the movements of Venus, a planet the Sumerians associated with Inanna herself. The connection between architecture and astronomy in these early cities was not decorative, it was structural. The buildings were designed so that specific celestial events, the rising of a star, the position of the sun at solstice, the first appearance of a planet after a period of invisibility, would interact with the physical space in visible, measurable ways. Light would enter a doorway at a precise angle. A shadow would fall across a threshold on a particular morning. These effects required not only observational skill, but long-term record-keeping. The kind of sustained attention to the scene that implies generations of accumulated knowledge passed down with care. This is the detail that lingers when you consider these cities together. The astronomical knowledge embedded in their earliest structures does not appear to develop gradually within the archaeological record. It arrives in many cases already functional. The builders of the first large temples at Uruk did not leave behind a sequence of failed experiments or progressively improved alignments. The structures work. They track what they were designed to track. And while this does not prove that the knowledge came from somewhere beyond the communities themselves, it raises a question that archaeology has not fully resolved. Where did the foundational understanding come from, and how was it transmitted so effectively across generations that had not yet developed formal writing? The cuneiform script that would later become the hallmark of Mesopotamian civilization did not appear until several centuries after these temples were already standing. Whatever system preserved the astronomical knowledge embedded in their design, it predated the written word. Some scholars attribute this to oral tradition, the capacity of human communities to transmit complex information through repeated storytelling, ritual, and apprenticeship. That explanation is plausible, and it accounts for a great deal of what early societies achieved, but it does not fully explain the precision. Oral traditions preserve themes, characters, and narrative arcs with remarkable fidelity. They are less reliable when it comes to exact angles, specific stellar positions, and the kind of numerical accuracy required to align a building with a celestial event that occurs only once a year. The gap between what oral tradition does well and what these structures demand is not enormous, but it is persistent, and it appears in nearly every early civilization that built with the sky in mind. It is a small discomfort in the record, the kind that does not disappear when you look away from it. The cities of southern Mesopotamia were not alone in this pattern. Across the ancient world, from Egypt to the Indus Valley to the highlands of Peru, the earliest monumental structures share a similar characteristic. They are oriented not toward neighbouring settlements or trade routes, but toward points in the sky. The specifics vary. The cultural contexts differ. The materials and methods reflect local environments, but the underlying impulse is the same: build upward, build with precision, and build in a direction that connects the ground to the heavens. Whether this impulse arose independently in each region, or whether it traces back to a shared source carried forward through migration, contact, or inherited memory, is one of the oldest unresolved questions in the study of early civilization. And it is a question that leads naturally from the plains of Mesopotamia toward a place far older, far stranger, and far more difficult to explain: a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, where the sky was written into stone long before anyone in the region had learned to farm. The hilltop that should not exist 12,000 years is not a number the human mind processes easily. It sits outside the range of intuition, too large for personal memory and too abstract to feel the way a century or even a millennium does. But that is roughly the age assigned to the earliest construction phase at Göbekli Tepe, a site perched on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey about 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa. When the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began systematic excavations there in 1995, he expected to find a medieval cemetery. What he uncovered instead was a series of monumental stone enclosures arranged in concentric patterns built with T-shaped limestone pillars weighing up to 15 tons each, carved with detailed reliefs of animals, foxes, vultures, scorpions, serpents, wild boar, and erected. At a time when, according to every model of human development available, the people living in this region were hunter-gatherers who had not yet domesticated a single crop or animal. The site did not fit. It still does not fit, and the discomfort it creates in the standard bar narrative of human progress has not diminished in the 3 decades since its discovery. The pillars themselves are the first thing that demands attention. They are not rough monoliths dragged into approximate positions. They are shaped deliberately carefully, with surfaces smoothed and edges defined in ways that suggest not only skill, but tradition. Some of the pillars bear arms carved in low relief along their sides, with hands meeting across the front of the stone fingers interlocking just above what appears to be a belt or garment. The implication is that the pillars represent beings, not abstract symbols, not decorative patterns, but figures. Whether those figures are ancestors' spirits or something the builders experienced directly is unknown, but the care taken in their creation speaks to something more than casual religious expression. These were important enough to justify the coordinated labour of hundreds of people in a period when permanent settlement had not yet taken root in the region, when food had to be hunted and gathered daily, and when the organisational structures needed to manage large-scale construction projects were not supposed to exist. That organisational problem is what makes Göbekli Tepe so persistently uncomfortable for conventional archaeology. Moving a 15-ton limestone block from a quarry to an elevated site, shaping it with stone tools, carving detailed imagery into its surface, and then erecting it in a precise position within a circular enclosure requires planning, coordination, sustained effort, and critically a shared purpose strong enough to justify the enormous cost in time and energy. Hunter-gatherer groups can accomplish remarkable things, and no serious scholar denies that. But the scale of Göbekli Tepe suggests something beyond something beyond opportunistic cooperation. It suggests a community that had already developed a system for organising labour, distributing tasks, and maintaining a project across what must have been years or even decades of continuous work. The question is where that system came from. If it evolved locally, it did so without leaving a clear trail of simpler precedents in the surrounding region. If it was introduced from elsewhere, the source has not been identified. There is another layer to the site that deepens the puzzle. Several researchers, most notably those working in the field of archaeoastronomy, have proposed that the arrangement of the enclosures and the orientation of specific pillars correspond to stellar positions. One widely discussed analysis published in 2017 by Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis of the University of Edinburgh argued that Pillar 43, a heavily carved stone in enclosure D, depicts a combination of animal symbols that correspond to constellations as they would have appeared around 10,950 BCE, potentially marking a significant astronomical event such as the summer solstice or the Younger Dryas impact period. The interpretation has been debated. Not all archaeologists accept the astronomical reading, and some have pointed out that the animal carvings could represent local fauna with symbolic meaning unrelated to the stars. But the proposal has not been dismissed outright, and the precision with which the symbols map to known constellation patterns is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. It is one of those details that sits quietly in the margin of the conversation, neither confirmed nor comfortably explained away. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe were encoding astronomical knowledge into their stone enclosures, they were doing so at a time when, according to the standard timeline, humanity had no reason to possess such knowledge. Tracking the position of constellations with enough accuracy to carve a permanent record into stone requires sustained observation across generations. It requires a method of passing that information forward without writing, without formal mathematics, and without the institutional structures that later civilizations used to maintain astronomical records. It requires, in other words, exactly the kind of inherited knowledge that the earlier Mesopotamian cities also seem to reflect, knowledge that appears in the record already formed, without a visible process of development behind it. The gap between what these communities should have known and what their construction suggests they did know is not dramatic. It's not the kind of gap that demands an extraordinary explanation. But it is consistent, and it appears at nearly every site where early monumental construction intersects with celestial alignment. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Sometime around 8000 BCE, the enclosures were filled in with soil rubble and animal bones, carefully intentionally, as though the builders or their descendants wanted to preserve the site rather than abandon it. The burial is what kept the carvings in such remarkable condition across 12 millennia. But it also raises the question of why. Communities do not typically invest enormous effort in burying their own monuments. They expand them, repurpose them, or leave them to decay. The deliberate interment of Göbekli Tepe suggests the site held a significance that outlasted its active use, a significance important enough to protect, even at the cost of hiding it from view. Whatever memory the stones held, someone believed it was worth sealing beneath the earth rather than risking its destruction. That impulse, the desire to preserve something understood only partially to protect a record whose full meaning had perhaps already begun to fade, is one of the oldest human instincts. And it is the same impulse that appears centuries and millennia later in the temple archives of Mesopotamia, the sealed tombs of Egypt, and the hidden chambers beneath pyramids, whose builders seem to have known that what they were preserving was older than their own civilization. From the buried hilltop of Göbekli Tepe, the thread of inherited memory stretches southward and forward in time, toward a place where the sky was not only observed and recorded, but built into the largest and most precisely engineered structures the ancient world would ever produce on a plateau west of the Nile, where 3 pyramids still hold their alignment with stars that no longer sit where they once did. The shafts that point to where nothing is what would compel a civilization to cut narrow channels through 2 million tons of limestone, not for ventilation, not for drainage, not for any structural purpose that engineers have been able to confirm, but to aim them with extraordinary precision at specific points in the sky. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, around 2560 BCE, contains 4 such shafts. 2 extend from the king's chamber and 2 from the queen's chamber, angled upward through the body of the pyramid at inclinations that do not correspond to any practical architectural function. They are too narrow for a person to pass through. They do not open to the exterior in a way that would allow meaningful airflow. What they do when their angles are projected outward into the sky of the mid-3rd millennium BC is point towards stars, specifically toward the belt of Orion and towards Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which the Egyptians associated with the goddess Isis. The alignment is not approximate. It is calculated within fractions of a degree, achieved inside a structure where the base dimensions are level to within 2.1 centimeters across a footprint of over 13 acres. That level of precision is not accidental. It is the result of a building culture that treated accuracy as a form of meaning. The connection between the Giza pyramids and Orion was most prominently proposed by Robert Bovell in the early 1990s. His Orion correlation theory suggested that the 3 pyramids on the Giza plateau, those of Khufu Khafre and Menkaure, were arranged to mirror the 3 stars of Orion's belt as they appeared in the sky and that the relative sizes and positions of the pyramids corresponded to the relative brightness and spacing of the stars. The theory drew immediate criticism from Egyptologists, many of whom pointed out that the correlation is imperfect, the angle of the pyramids does not precisely match the angle of the belt stars, and the theory requires the map to be flipped or rotated to achieve alignment. These are legitimate objections, and they have not been fully resolved, but they have also not eliminated the broader observation that the Giza complex taken as a whole demonstrates a relationship with the sky that goes beyond seasonal tracking or agricultural timing. The pyramid texts among the oldest religious writings in the world, inscribed in the pyramids of later dynasties at Saqqara, describe the pharaoh's soul ascending to join Orion in the sky, becoming one with the stars, returning to a celestial realm, described not as metaphor but as destination. The shafts in the Great Pyramid, whether or not they align with Bovell's specific model, reflect the same impulse, a physical structure designed to connect the ground to the heavens, through a line so direct it could be drawn with a ruler. What makes the Egyptian case significant in the context of inherited memory is not any single alignment but the depth of astronomical knowledge that the alignments collectively imply. The builders of the Great Pyramid understood cardinal directions with a precision that modern surveyors would respect. They understood the geometry of angles well enough to cut shafts through solid stone at inclinations that match stellar positions. They understood the movement of stars well enough to identify which celestial bodies would be visible at specific angles from a specific latitude at a specific time of year. And they did all of this within a civilization that, according to the standard archaeological record, had transitioned from semi-nomadic farming communities to monumental architecture in a remarkably compressed period. The step from the earliest mastaba tombs to the Great Pyramid spans roughly 3 centuries apace of development that some researchers have described as unusually rapid given the complexity of what was achieved. Not impossible, not inexplicable, but fast enough to raise the same quiet question that Göbekli Tepe and the Mesopotamian temples raised: was the foundational knowledge developed entirely within the culture that used it, or was some portion of it inherited from a source that predated the civilization itself? Egyptian texts offer their own version of an answer, though it is not the kind of answer that satisfies empirical inquiry. The Palermo stone and the Turin King List fragmentary records of Egyptian royal chronology both include sections that describe a period before the historical dynasties, a time when Egypt was ruled by divine beings or demigods who preceded human pharaohs. These pre-dynastic rulers are sometimes called the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, and their reigns are assigned lengths that echo the impossible durations found in the Sumerian King List. The parallel is not exact, but it is persistent. 2 of the oldest literate civilizations in the world, separated by geography and language, both preserve records of a period when rulership was held by beings whose lifespans and origins did not conform to ordinary human experience, and both associate that period with knowledge, astronomical, architectural, organizational, that their later human successors inherited but did not fully replicate. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid remain sealed at their inner ends. Robotic explorations in 1993 and 2002 revealed small stone doors fitted with copper handles deep within the Queen's Chamber, shafts features that suggest intentional closure rather than incomplete construction. Whatever lies beyond those doors, if anything, has not been accessed in modern times. The shafts point outward towards stars that have shifted position over 4.5 millennia of precession. The sky they were built to address no longer matches the sky above Giza, but the intention encoded in their angles remains legible. A civilization reaching toward a specific place in the heavens with a specificity that implies not worship alone but recognition, as though the builders knew where they were pointing and why it mattered. From the stone corridors of Giza, the thread continues not westward or eastward, along familiar trade routes, but across the Atlantic toward a valley in the Andes, where another civilization built with the same impossible precision, the same celestial awareness, and the same about where their knowledge began. The domes that remember a different sun, so at 3,400 meters above sea level, the air over Cusco thins enough that sound carries differently. Voices flatten, wind sharpens, and the silence between gusts feels wider than it does at lower altitudes. The city sits in a narrow valley in the southeastern Peruvian Andes, surrounded by peaks that hold snow for most of the year. Long before the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, long before the Inca Empire consolidated its authority across Western South America, this valley was considered sacred. The Inca called it the navel of the world, a center point from which everything radiated outward. But the structures they built here and the structures that may have preceded them suggest that the valley's significance was not only geographic, it was directional. The old city was laid out in alignments that tracked the sun, the moon, and specific stellar positions with consistency that architects and archaeologists continue to study. The orientation was not incidental. It was the organizing principle of the entire urban plan, as though the city itself was a device designed to maintain a relationship with the sky. Above the old city centre, on a steep hillside to the north, sit the walls of Sacsayhuama, a complex of massive stone blocks fitted together without mortar, with joints so precise that a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. Some of the individual stones weigh over 100 tons. They are not rectangular. They are polygonal, cut into irregular shapes with multiple angles, each face ground smooth enough to lock flush against its neighbour. The technique is unlike anything found in European or Asian masonry traditions of comparable age. It does not rely on uniform blocks stacked in courses. Instead, it treats each stone as a unique piece of a puzzle shaped to fit one specific position and no other. How this was achieved with the tools available to pre-Columbian Andean cultures remains an open question. Bronze chisels, stone hammers and abrasive sand can account for some of the shaping, but the precision of the joints, particularly on curved or angled faces, exceeds what experimental archaeology has been able to replicate consistently using those methods alone. The gap is not insurmountable. It is not evidence of impossibility, but it is the kind of gap that resists easy closure, and it appears at nearly every major Inca and pre-Inca stone site across the Andean highlands. Machu Picchu, located roughly 80 kilometers northwest of Cusco on a ridge between two peaks, carries the same signature. The site is famous for its dramatic setting, but its astronomical features are what make it significant in the context of inherited knowledge. At its center stands the Intihuatana stone, a carved granite pillar whose name is often translated as the hitching post of the sun. During the equinoxes, the sun stands almost directly above the pillar, casting virtually no shadow at midday. The stone functions as a precise solar marker calibrated to a specific latitude and a specific moment in the annual cycle. It is not the only such marker at the site. The Temple of the Three Windows, the Room of the Sun, and several other structures are oriented towards solstice, sunrises or sunsets, creating a network of alignments that together form an integrated astronomical observatory embedded within the architecture of daily life. The people who built Machu Picchu did not separate their knowledge of the sky from their knowledge of shelter agriculture or water management. All of it was woven together into a single fabric, as though the information had arrived as a unified system rather than accumulating in separate disciplines over time. The Inca attributed much of their knowledge to Viracocha, a figure described in their oral tradition as a creator who came from across the water, who taught the people and then departed, walking westward across the Pacific and promising to return. Viracocha was not described as a god born from the elements or a spirit dwelling in nature. He was described as a traveller, someone who arrived, stayed influenced, and left. The pattern echoes what the Sumerians recorded about their Apkallu, the seven sages, who brought knowledge from the god Enki to early humanity. It echoes what the Egyptians described in their accounts of the Shemsu-Hor. The names differ. The geographies differ. The cultural details are shaped by entirely distinct traditions, but the underlying structure of the story, a knowledgeable figure arrives from elsewhere, teaches foundational skills, establishes order, and then departs, appears with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. It is a pattern that crosses not only oceans but millennia, surfacing in civilizations that had no plausible mechanism for exchanging detailed mythological narratives with one another. Some anthropologists explain this pattern through the lens of universal human psychology, the tendency for societies to project authority onto external founding figures as a way of legitimizing their own institutions. That explanation has merit, and it accounts for the general shape of the stories. What it accounts for less comfortably is the specificity. The Sumerian sages bring particular skills writing agriculture, astronomy, architecture. Viracocha teaches particular techniques, stoneworking, irrigation, social organization. The Egyptian divine rulers are associated with particular bodies of knowledge, measurement, construction, celestial navigation. These are not vague claims of divine inspiration. They are catalogues of applied knowledge, preserved in traditions that treat their sources as real beings who physically interacted with early human communities. The stories do not describe revelation. They describe instruction delivered in person over time, by figures who eventually walked away. Whether any of these traditions preserve memories of actual contact with beings from beyond Earth is a question that no single site or text can answer. But the convergence of precision stonework, celestial alignment, and origin myths describing arriving teachers appearing independently in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Andes forms a pattern whose edges are too clean to blur comfortably into coincidence. It's a pattern that asks not for belief but for continued attention, and it leads from the high stones of the Andes back across the world toward a broader question, one that the next chapter will sit with honestly. What if all of these connections are simply the product of human creativity, and the pattern is something we are building rather than discovering? The simplest explanations. It would be dishonest to move forward without pausing here. Everything discussed so far, the alignments, the origin myths, the precision stonework, the astronomical knowledge embedded in structures older than writing, can be explained without reference to a wandering planet or visitors from the sky. The explanations are not exotic. They do not require hidden civilizations or lost technologies. They require only what mainstream archaeology, anthropology, and cognitive science have long proposed: that human beings are extraordinarily creative, deeply pattern-seeking, and capable of achievements that later generations sometimes underestimate. Sitting with that possibility is not a retreat from the questions raised in previous chapters. It is a necessary part of taking those questions seriously. Because a question explored without honest counterweight is not exploration, it is persuasion wearing a quieter voice. The first and most substantial objection concerns the so-called sudden appearance of complex knowledge. The argument that agriculture writing astronomy and monumental architecture appeared too quickly to have developed independently is a recurring feature of alternative history narratives, and it rests on a claim that the archaeological record does not fully support. Take cuneiform, for example. The finished script, the wedge-shaped impressions on clay tablets found across Mesopotamia, does appear sophisticated from its earliest known examples, but it did not emerge from nothing. Archaeologists have documented a long sequence of precursor technologies stretching back thousands of years before the first true cuneiform texts. Clay tokens used for accounting appear as early as 8000 BCE. Bully hollow clay envelopes containing those tokens appear by the 4th millennium. Proto-cuneiform signs, simpler and more pictographic than the later script, appear on tablets from Uruk around 3400 BCE. The transition from token to tablet to script was gradual, spanning nearly 5,000 years of incremental development. Describing cuneiform as arriving fully formed compresses that timeline in a way that misrepresents the evidence. The same argument applies with varying degrees of strength to agriculture, metallurgy, and urban planning. In each case, the archaeological record contains intermediate stages, less refined, less organized, less effective versions of the technologies that later appeared in their mature forms. The leaps were real, but they were not as sudden as they sometimes appear, when the intermediate evidence is overlooked or underrepresented. The second objection addresses the cross-cultural parallels that seem to connect distant civilizations, the winged disk in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the solar deity with rays in Sumer and India, the origin myth of a teacher arriving from the sky appearing on every inhabited continent. These similarities are genuinely striking, and dismissing them as irrelevant would be careless. But there is a well-established framework for understanding them that does not require direct contact or a shared extraterrestrial origin: convergent cultural evolution. The tendency for unrelated societies facing similar conditions to develop similar responses explains a great deal of the overlap. Human beings everywhere watch the same sun, the same moon, the same cycle of seasons. They experience birth, death, flood, drought, and the movement of stars across the same sky. It would be surprising if their mythologies did not share common elements. The sun is universally visible, universally powerful, and universally associated with life. Wings represent flight transcendence, elevation concepts that arise naturally in any culture that observes birds. A circle with rays is the simplest possible representation of the sun. These symbols do not require a shared source, they require only a shared environment and a shared neurology. The argument from convergence does not explain every parallel, some remain specific enough to resist easy generalization, but it accounts for the broad pattern convincingly enough that the parallels alone cannot carry the weight of an extraordinary claim. The third objection concerns astronomical alignments in ancient structures. The precision of these alignments is real. The Great Pyramid's orientation to true north is accurate to within 3/60 of a degree. Göbekli Tepe's pillar carvings may correspond to stellar positions. Andean sites track solstices and equinoxes with measurable accuracy. But precision in alignment does not by itself require knowledge imported from beyond the culture that produced it. Human beings are remarkably capable observers. Given sufficient motivation, agricultural timing, religious piety, navigational need, communities can develop accurate astronomical knowledge through sustained observation over generations. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians, for example, encode detailed knowledge of stellar positions, planetary movements, and even variable stars accumulated and transmitted without writing across tens of thousands of years. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using stellar knowledge passed down entirely through oral instruction and practical apprenticeship. These are not speculative examples, they are documented, studied, and well understood. They demonstrate that the human capacity for precise astronomical observation does not depend on written records, formal mathematics, or external instruction. It depends on attention repetition and the motivation to remember what matters for survival. These three objections, the gradual development of technologies, the convergence of cultural symbols, and their independent capacity for astronomical precision are not dismissals. They are the strongest available explanations for the patterns described in previous chapters, and they deserve to sit in the conversation with full weight. Any honest engagement with the idea of inherited extraterrestrial knowledge must acknowledge that the evidence cited in its support can, in most individual cases, be explained by human capability alone. The discomfort arises not from any single piece of evidence, but from the accumulation from the way the same kinds of anomalies appear at the same transitional moments in civilizations separated by oceans and millennia. Convergent evolution explains why different cultures might develop similar symbols. It explains less comfortably why those cultures also share similar origin narratives with similar structural details. Arriving teachers, specific catalogues of knowledge, eventual departure wrapped around technologies that appear at roughly the same stage of development in each case. The pattern may be coincidence. It may be the natural shape of human cultural evolution repeated because the underlying conditions are universal. The unease is that the explanation, while sufficient for any single case, feels slightly strained when asked to account for all of them simultaneously. It may be natural and may be chance. The discomfort is that certainty in either direction remains just out of reach. What follows in the next chapter is not an attempt to override these objections, but to continue examining the texture of the pattern, moving from structures and myths towards something less visible but equally persistent, the way ancient languages themselves seem to carry traces of a memory that their speakers could no longer fully articulate. Words that remember what the speakers forgot of the Sumerian word and mean sky. It also means heaven. It also means God. In a language where context determines meaning and where a single sign can carry multiple readings, depending on the surrounding text, this convergence might seem remarkable. A simple case of polysemy, the way bank in English, refers to both a riverbed and a financial institution. But Sumerian is not a casual language. It was used with extraordinary precision in administrative, literary, and religious contexts for over 2,000 years. Its scribes were trained professionals who understood the distinctions between words and who chose their signs deliberately. When it appears in a royal inscription, a hymn, or a mythological text, the layered meaning is not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which the sky, the divine, and the place of origin occupied the same conceptual space, not metaphorically but structurally. The sky was where the gods came from. The gods were the sky, and the sky was not an abstraction. It was a location, a direction, a place that could be pointed to, and in the oldest traditions a place from which specific beings had physically descended. This linguistic architecture extends into the names and titles of the beings the Sumerians described as their earliest rulers and teachers. The word Anunnaki itself has been translated in various ways, those of royal blood, princely offspring, or in a more literal decomposition, those who from heaven to earth came. The exact parsing depends on which grammatical framework is applied, and scholars disagree on the precision of any single translation. But what is consistent across interpretations is the directional element. The Anunnaki are defined by movement. They are not static deities dwelling in a fixed celestial realm. They are figures associated with descent, with travelling from one place to another, from above to below, from the sky to the ground. That directional quality is unusual among ancient divine figures. Many mythological traditions describe gods who simply exist in their respective domains, a sea god in the sea, an earth goddess in the earth. The Anunnaki are different. Their identity is inseparable from the act of arriving. They are at their linguistic core beings defined not by where they reside, but by the journey that brought them here. This characteristic is not confined to Sumerian. Akkadian, the Semitic language that gradually replaced Sumerian as the spoken language of Mesopotamia, while preserving much of its literary tradition, carried the same conceptual framework forward. The Akkadian word Ilum, meaning God, derives from a root associated with height, elevation, and the upper realm. Babylonian and Assyrian texts continued to describe their divine figures using spatial language above, descended, crossed, returned, reinforcing a tradition in which the sacred was not merely powerful but geographically distinct. The gods did not emerge from the landscape. They came to it. They arrived from a specific direction, and that direction was consistently upward. Even when later theological developments abstracted these figures into more symbolic roles, the underlying vocabulary preserved the older meaning. The words remembered what the theology had begun to forget. A similar pattern appears in ancient Egyptian. The hieroglyphic determinative for God, the flag, like symbol placed after a divine name to classify it, is itself associated with height and elevation. The Egyptian concept of Nita, often translated as God, carried connotations of renewal, cyclical return, and transformative power, but its visual representation consistently pointed upward. The pyramid texts inscribed in the burial chambers of 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs describe the king's journey after death as an ascent, a physical movement toward the circumpolar stars, toward Orion, toward a realm described not in abstract spiritual terms, but in directional, almost navigational language. The texts instruct the deceased pharaoh on how to cross the sky, how to pass through gates, how to join the company of beings who dwell among the stars. These are not meditations on the nature of the divine. They are itineraries. They describe a route, and the route leads to a specific region of the sky, the same region that the shafts of the Great Pyramid were built to point toward. Across the Atlantic, in the oral traditions of the Quechua-speaking peoples of the Andes, a parallel structure appears. Viracocha, the creator figure discussed in the previous chapter, carries a name whose etymology remains debated, but which some linguists associate with foam of the sea or fat of the lake descriptions that suggest emergence from water rather than descent from the sky. Yet the stories told about Viracocha consistently describe him arriving from a distant place, teaching specific skills, and then departing across the water or into the sky. The name and the narrative do not align perfectly, which is itself interesting. Suggests that the name may have been applied retroactively to a figure whose original identity had already shifted through centuries of retelling. The linguistic surface says one thing, the structural memory beneath it says another, and the structural memory, the pattern of arrival, instruction and departure matches what appears in Mesopotamia and Egypt, despite the absence of any known contact between these traditions. One detail in the Sumerian literary corpus adds a quieter layer to this linguistic thread. The term me, pronounced roughly as me, refers to the divine attributes or cultural principles that govern civilization. The me are not abstract virtues, they are specific and innumerable kingship priesthood truth, the descent into the underworld, the art of metalworking, the scribal arts music, the making of decisions. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu and acquires the me from the god Enki through a combination of persuasion and intoxication. She carries them back to her own city of Uruk in a boat, and their arrival transforms the city into a centre of civilization. The me are treated not as ideas, but as objects, things that can be held, transported, stolen, and installed. This materiality is striking. Knowledge in the Sumerian framework is not discovered. It is received. It is carried from one place to another by beings who possess it physically. The language does not describe enlightenment. It describes delivery. Whether these linguistic patterns reflect genuine memories of contact with beings from another world, or simply the natural architecture of early human thought about the sacred, is not something language alone can resolve. Words preserve structure. They preserve direction and relationship and emphasis, but they do not preserve proof. What they do preserve, with remarkable consistency across unrelated language families, is the idea that knowledge came from somewhere specific, that it was brought by someone identifiable, and that the sky was not merely a symbol of the divine but the actual origin point of what made civilization possible. The words carry a map, even if the destination they describe has long since faded from view. It is from this linguistic landscape where the memory of descent and instruction is embedded in the grammar of the oldest known civilizations, that the trail moves forward into something harder to read but no less persistent. The physical record of materials extracted from the earth in quantities and at dates that the standard timeline struggles to accommodate comfortably. The mines that precede the cities. In 1967, a team of archaeologists working in the Ngwenya Hills of northwestern Eswatini, then known as Swaziland, uncovered the entrance to a mining tunnel that had been sealed by centuries of sediment and rockfall. The site, known as Lion Cavern, sits at an elevation of roughly 1,130 meters on the western slope of a range that overlooks the Mozambique coastal plain. Radiocarbon dating of the charcoal and bone fragments found within the earliest occupation layers returned dates that placed the beginning of mining activity at approximately 43,000 years ago. That number made Lion Cavern one of the oldest known mining operations in the world, a site where early humans had systematically extracted material from within a hillside at a time when, according to standard models, human behavior was still overwhelmingly focused on hunting, gathering, and the gradual development of simple tools. The mineral being extracted was hematite, a red iron oxide used primarily as a pigment for body decoration ritual marking, and possibly early symbolic art. But the scale and depth of the excavation suggested something more organized than casual pigment collection. The tunnels extended meters into the rock. The work required sustained effort across generations. Someone had decided tens of thousands of years before the first cities were built that what lay inside this particular hillside was worth the labor of digging it out. Lion Cavern is not the only ancient mining site in southern Africa. Across the region, in parts of modern Eswatini, South Africa, Zimbabwe and Mozambique, archaeologists have identified mining operations that date back tens of thousands of years. Many of these sites targeted iron oxides or specularite materials associated with pigment and decorative use. But a smaller number of sites, particularly in the gold-bearing regions of the Witwatersrand Basin and surrounding areas, show evidence of extraction activity that is harder to categorize neatly. Gold deposits in southern Africa are among the richest in the world, formed through geological processes spanning billions of years. The region's gold-bearing reefs have been mined intensively in the modern era, and that industrial activity has complicated the archaeological record. But traces of earlier pre-industrial extraction have been identified at several locations. Traces that include ancient stone tools found in proximity to exposed gold reefs and excavation patterns that predate any known local use for gold as currency ornamentation or trade material. The dating of these traces remains contested, and no consensus exists on whether they represent deliberate gold extraction or incidental activity associated with other mining purposes. But the presence of organized mining activity in these regions at dates far earlier than the emergence of complex societies adds a texture to the record that does not resolve easily into standard explanations. This is where the Sumerian literary tradition introduces a word that resonates uncomfortably with the geography of southern Africa. The term Abzu, sometimes written as Apsu, appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts with layered meanings. In cosmological context, it refers to the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the domain of the god Enki. In other contexts, particularly those associated with the Anunnaki narratives, it refers to a distant place, a region associated with mining labour, and the extraction of resources from deep within the ground. Some translations describe it as the deep or the far below. Sitchin and others in the alternative history tradition identified the Abzu with southern Africa, arguing that the term described the region where the Anunnaki directed mining operations for gold, needed to sustain the atmosphere of their homeworld. Mainstream Assyriologists reject this identification, treating the Abzu as a mythological concept rather than a geographic reference. The scholarly consensus is clear, but the texts themselves are less tidy than the consensus might suggest. The Atrahasis epic describes the Anunnaki dividing their labour between those who worked above in the settled regions of Mesopotamia and those who worked below in the Abzu, performing extraction work so physically demanding that it eventually provoked rebellion. The narrative does not describe the Abzu as a spiritual underworld. It describes it as a workplace, a place where beings dig, carry and suffer under the weight of their labour. The language is concrete, the complaints are specific. Whatever the Abzu was, it was not comfortable. The connection between Mesopotamian texts and African mining remains speculative. No cuneiform tablet has been found in southern Africa. No African archaeological site has yielded Sumerian artifacts. The gap between the literary record of one region and the physical record of another has not been bridged by any direct evidence. And yet the coincidence sits in an awkward position. A region described in the oldest surviving narratives as a place of deep mining overlapping geographically with a region that contains some of the oldest mining operations and richest gold deposits on Earth. The coincidence does not prove a connection, but it occupies the kind of space where dismissal feels slightly premature and acceptance feels slightly reckless, leaving only the option of noting it and moving forward with appropriate caution. What is less speculative is the role gold played in the mythological framework of early Mesopotamian civilization. Gold in Sumerian and Akkadian texts is not treated the way it would later be treated in Greek, Roman or modern economies as a store of value or a medium of exchange. It is treated as a material with specific properties and specific applications. The gods desired it. They required it. The Anunnaki narratives associate gold not with wealth but with necessity, a resource extracted under duress for purposes that the human scribes recording the stories may not have fully understood. The Atrahasis epic frames the creation of humanity itself as a solution to the labour crisis caused by the burden of extraction work. Humans were made in the narrative's own terms to carry the load that the lesser gods could no longer bear. Read as metaphor, this is a story about the origins of labour and social hierarchy. Read as compressed memory, it describes a species created or modified specifically to perform resource extraction for beings who had travelled a great distance to obtain something their own world could no longer provide. The mines of southern Africa do not answer the question of whether this reading is correct. They offer no inscriptions, no artefacts, linking them to Mesopotamia, and no clear evidence of purpose beyond what local analysis can support. But they sit in the record the way a half-remembered word sits on the edge of speech, present suggestive and difficult to place in a sentence that makes complete sense. They are among the oldest evidence of organised human labour on Earth, and they extracted materials from regions that the oldest human narratives describe as important for reasons that have never been fully explained. From the deep ground of southern Africa, the thread surfaces again, carrying with it the question of what gold meant to the earliest civilizations and why the material that modern economies treat as a symbol of wealth may once have served a purpose far more literal, far more urgent and far older than the cities that eventually built their treasuries around it. The breath that was not a metaphor. Around 70,000 years ago, something changed. The archaeological record does not pinpoint it with the neatness of a single event or a dated artifact, but across the layers of sediment and stone that preserve humanity's deep past. A shift becomes visible gradual in some interpretations, abruptly concentrated in others. The tools grow more varied. The materials diversify. Symbolic objects appear: shell beads, ochre, carvings, geometric marks scratched into bone, suggesting a mind that has begun to think not only about what is present, but about what is absent, what is possible, and what can be represented. Archaeologists call this transition the emergence of behavioural modernity, and its timing has been debated for decades. Some researchers place it earlier, pushing the evidence back to 100,000 years or more. Others argue that the full suite of modern cognitive behaviour language, long-range planning, symbolic art, complex social organisation crystallised within a relatively compressed window between 70 and 50,000 years ago. Whatever the exact chronology, the pattern is consistent at some point in the late Pleistocene. Homo sapiens began doing things that no previous hominin species had done, and the pace of innovation accelerated in ways that the preceding hundreds of thousands of years of gradual development had not predicted. The standard explanation for this transition is elegant and well supported. It involves a combination of factors, genetic mutations affecting brain development, particularly in areas associated with language and abstract thought, environmental pressures that rewarded cooperation, planning and communication, population dynamics that increased the rate of cultural transmission between groups. Each of these factors is documented in the fossil and genetic record. Together, they provide a plausible and internally consistent account of how a moderately successful primate species became the most cognitively complex organism on the planet. The explanation does not require external intervention. It does not need visitors or teachers or genetic manipulation from another world. It needs only time pressure and the mechanisms of natural selection operating on a species that was already unusually social and unusually flexible. This is the mainstream position, and it carries the weight of broad scientific consensus behind it. And yet there is a texture to the transition that the standard model describes without fully explaining. The speed is one element. Evolution as a rule does not produce rapid transformations in complex traits. Neural architecture, the physical structure of the brain that supports cognition, changes slowly across thousands of generations, but the behavioral changes associated with modernity appear faster than the underlying biology seems to permit. The brains of Homo sapiens living 150,000 years ago were anatomically similar to modern human brains. The hardware in a rough sense was already in place. What changed was the software, the way that hardware was used, the patterns of behavior it produced, the complexity of the output. Something activated a capacity that had existed in latent form for tens of thousands of years. Geneticists have identified candidate mutations, particularly in genes like FOXP2, associated with fine motor control of the mouth and throat mutations that may have enabled the development of articulate speech. These findings are significant, but they describe triggers, not causes. They explain how a specific capacity became possible, not why it became dominant when it did, or why the full cascade of modern behaviors followed in what amounts to an evolutionary instant. The Sumerian account of human creation compressed into the language of myth describes a process that resonates with this ambiguity in ways that are difficult to ignore entirely. In the Atrahasis epic and in later Babylonian versions of the same tradition, humanity is created through a deliberate act, not from nothing but from existing material. Clay is taken from the earth, blood is taken from a slain god. The two are mixed. The result is a new being, one capable of labor communication and the maintenance of the systems the gods had established. The language is mythological. The framework is divine. But beneath the surface, the narrative describes something strikingly specific, an existing biological substrate, the clay, the earth, the raw material of life already present on the planet, combined with something introduced from an external source, the blood, the essence, the contribution of a being whose origins are not terrestrial. The result is not a new species created from scratch, but a modified version of something that already existed upgraded for a specific set of purposes. Read as literature, this is a creation myth like many others. Read as compressed memory, it describes a hybridization event, a moment when an existing population was altered through contact with a genetically distinct group whose contributions changed the trajectory of human development. This reading is not scientifically supported. No genetic evidence has been found indicating extraterrestrial contribution to the human genome. The tools of modern genomics, which can identify ancient interbreeding events between Homo sapiens Neanderthals and Denisovans with remarkable precision, have not revealed a signal that points to an origin beyond Earth. The absence of such evidence is significant, and it must be acknowledged honestly. But the mythological tradition persists not in one culture but in many. The Egyptians described humanity as shaped from clay on a potter's wheel by the ram-headed god Khnum, who then placed the breath of life into each new being. The Quechua traditions of the Andes describe Viracocha creating humans from stone and clay, breathing life into them and teaching them the skills of civilization. Greek mythology describes Prometheus shaping humans from clay and Athena, breathing soul into them. In each case, the structure is identical raw material from the earth, animated by breath or essence from a being who is not of the earth. The repetition of this precise formula earth plus external breath across civilizations with no documented contact raises the same quiet question that the architectural alignments and linguistic patterns raised in earlier chapters. It may be archetypal. It may be the inevitable shape that creation myths take when emerging from certain cognitive structures. But its specificity, always clay, always breath, always a directed act by a being from elsewhere, makes the archetypal explanation feel like a partial answer rather than a complete one. One detail in the Atrahasis narrative adds a finer point. The text specifies that the being whose blood was used in the creation of humanity was chosen not at random, but deliberately a god described as possessing temu, a word associated with intelligence planning and rational capacity. The purpose was explicit. The quality of the source material mattered, because it would determine the cognitive capacity of the resulting beings. This is not a vague description of divine power infusing inert matter. It is a description of selective input, choosing a specific donor for a specific trait in order to produce a specific outcome. The language is mythological, the logic is procedural, and the gap between the two, between the story being told and the process being described, is where the question continues to live undisturbed by either proof or refutation. From the clay and breath of the oldest creation narratives, the thread stretches forward into time, toward the moment when the beings who may have shaped humanity's cognitive foundations began to withdraw, leaving behind a species equipped to continue alone, but haunted by memories of teachers who walked among them, and then slowly, without ceremony, disappeared into a silence that would last for millennia. The long silence. After the teachers left, the Sumerian king list does not describe the transition gently. It records a breaker line that divides the antediluvian rulers whose reigns stretched across tens of thousands of years from the post-diluvian dynasties whose reigns measured in decades and centuries. The dividing event is a flood. After the flood, kingship descends again, but it descends differently. The rulers are human. Their lifespans are mortal. Their authority is inherited through lineage rather than granted from above. The list does not explain what happened to the earlier rulers. It does not say where they went or whether they survived. It simply moves forward as though the world before the flood and the world after it were separated by something wider than water, a rupture in the kind of beings who governed and the kind of knowledge they carried. Whatever existed before the break continued only in diminished form afterward, preserved in fragments rather than in fullness, maintained by inheritors rather than originators. This pattern, a period of divine or semi-divine presence followed by withdrawal and silence, appears not only in Mesopotamian tradition, but across the mythological landscape of the ancient world. The Giza and Egyptians described a time before the historical dynasties when the gods ruled directly, followed by the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, who served as intermediaries, and then by human pharaohs who claimed divine descent but did not possess divine capabilities. The Greek tradition described a golden age, when gods walked among mortals, followed by progressive decline through silver, bronze, and iron ages, each more distant from the original source of knowledge and harmony. Hindu cosmology describes a cycle of Yuga, Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali in which the world moves progressively further from truth and order, the divine presence fading with each successive age. In the Andes, the departure of Viracocha marked the beginning of a period when the knowledge he brought had to be maintained by human effort alone without the guiding presence of the original teacher. In each case, the narrative arc is the semmed beings of greater knowledge arrive, shape the world, and then withdraw, leaving humanity to manage what remains with diminishing understanding and increasing distance from the source. The consistency of this arc across unrelated traditions is what gives it weight. A single culture describing a lost golden age might be expressing nostalgia, the universal human tendency to idealize the past. Two cultures doing so might reflect shared psychological patterns. But when the same structure appears in Sumer Egypt, Greece, India, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, complete with specific references to arriving teachers, catalogues of transmitted knowledge, and eventual departure, the pattern begins to resist purely psychological explanation. It behaves less like an archetype and more like a memory distorted differently in each tradition, but preserving the same fundamental shape. Someone was here, they taught, they left, and what remained after their departure was not the full body of what they knew, but a thinning echo carried forward by people who understood they had received something important without fully grasping its origin or its scope. The material record supports the idea of post-departure decline, though it frames the evidence differently. In Mesopotamia, the earliest monumental structures, the deep temple layers at Eridu, the Eanna precinct at Uruk, show a level of planning and astronomical alignment that later construction in the same regions does not always match. Later ziggurats are larger but not necessarily more precise. Later temples are more ornate but not more accurately oriented. The peak of certain technical capacities appears to occur early in the sequence, rather than late, as though the first builders had access to knowledge that was partially lost by their successors. In Egypt, a similar pattern has been noted. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built during the 4th dynasty, remains the most precisely engineered structure in the ancient world. The pyramids built by later dynasties, the 5th, 6th and beyond, are the smaller, less precisely constructed, and in many cases have deteriorated far more severely. The trajectory is not one of continuous improvement. It is one of early excellence followed by gradual simplification, as though a body of knowledge was being consumed without being replenished. This decline does not require an extraordinary explanation. Knowledge loss is a well-documented phenomenon in human history. The Romans built concrete structures that lasted millennia. After the fall of Rome, the formula for Roman concrete was lost for over 1,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism, a Greek astronomical calculator of extraordinary sophistication, had no known successor for centuries. Libraries burned, scribal traditions were interrupted, conquest destroyed institutional knowledge. The loss of technical skill across generations is not unusual. It is in fact the norm in human history. Civilizations do not progress in a straight upward line. They rise peak and decline, carrying some knowledge forward and losing the rest. The early excellence observed in Mesopotamia and Egypt could simply reflect the concentrated effort of societies at their peak, followed by the natural entropy that affects all complex systems over time. But the mythological tradition adds a dimension that entropy alone does not account for. The stories do not describe knowledge being lost through negligence or conquest. They describe it being withdrawn, taken away by the beings who originally provided it. The gods did not simply die or fade. They departed. They returned to the sky. They crossed the water. They walked beyond the horizon. The language is active, not passive. The silence that followed was not the result of human failure. It was the result of absence, the removal of a presence that had sustained a level of understanding beyond what humanity could maintain alone. Whether this narrative reflects historical events or the human tendency to externalize the causes of cultural decline is precisely the question that cannot be settled from the evidence available. Both readings fit the pattern. Neither fully excludes the other. What the silence left behind was not emptiness, but a particular kind of longing, a sense preserved in ritual architecture and story that something essential had been present and was now gone. That longing carried forward through millennia of civilization eventually shaped not only how ancient people remembered their past, but how they imagined their future, a future in which the sky remained not merely a backdrop of stars, but a direction, a destination, and perhaps the place where the answers to humanity's oldest questions still waited to be found. The instinct that has no earthly origin, that longing, the quiet pull toward the sky, that ancient civilizations encoded in their temples, their myths, and their burial rites did not fade when the civilizations themselves declined. It migrated. It changed form. It moved from ziggurat to cathedral, from stellar alignment to telescope lens, from mythological narrative to scientific hypothesis. But its essential character remained unchanged across every transformation, a persistent species-wide impulse to look upward and feel that something important exists there. Not just light, not just distance, something familiar, something that tugs at the edges of recognition without ever resolving into a clear image. Modern psychology has frameworks for this feeling: the overview effect experienced by astronauts, the existential weight of contemplating cosmic scale, the neurological tendency to find meaning in pattern and vastness. These explanations are useful. They describe the mechanism, but they do not fully account for the specificity of the human relationship with the sky, which is unlike the relationship any other species on Earth maintains with the space above it. Birds navigate by starlight. Dung beetles orient using the Milky Way. Several species of marine life respond to lunar cycles with biological precision. But none of these organisms contemplate the sky. None of them build structures to mirror it. None of them compose narratives about having originated there. The human response to the night sky is categorically different from any other biological relationship with celestial phenomena observed on this planet. It is not navigational. It is not reproductive. It is not seasonal. It is emotional in a way that does not serve any obvious survival function. People weep when they see the Earth from orbit. They describe feelings of recognition when standing beneath a clear sky in a remote landscape. They use the word home in contexts that have nothing to do with the ground beneath their feet. Astronauts returning from space repeatedly describe not the alienness of what they experienced, but the familiarity, as though the view from above confirmed something they had always suspected without being able to name. This response is not universal in its intensity, but it is universal in its direction. Across cultures, across centuries, across every measurable variable of human experience, the sky is treated as more than environment. It is treated as origin. The modern era has translated this instinct into action. In the span of a single century, humanity moved from wooden biplanes to orbital stations, from speculative fiction about visiting the moon to actual boot prints in lunar dust. The pace of that transition is often attributed to competition, the Cold War, the space race, the economic incentives of satellite technology. And those factors are real, but beneath them lies something older, something that preceded the political frameworks and technological capacities that made space exploration possible. The desire to leave the planet did not begin with rocketry. It began with the first human being who looked upward and felt that they were looking towards something rather than merely looking at something. The rockets followed the instinct. The instinct did not follow the rockets. When the Voyager 1 spacecraft was launched in 1977, it carried a golden record, a disk containing sounds, images, greetings in 55 languages, and a selection of music intended to represent humanity to any intelligence that might encounter the probe in the distant future. The choice of gold as the medium is usually explained in practical terms. Gold is durable, resistant to corrosion, and capable of surviving the conditions of interstellar space. But the symbolic resonance is difficult to overlook entirely. Humanity's first deliberate message to the cosmos was inscribed on the same material that the oldest myths describe as the resource the visitors came to Earth to find. The connection is almost certainly coincidental. But it is the kind of coincidence that accumulates weight in a story already dense with parallels between ancient memory and modern behaviour. The same instinct that placed a golden record on a spacecraft bound for interstellar space also drives the ongoing search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Programs like SETI have spent decades scanning the sky for signals patterns in radio waves or optical emissions that would indicate the presence of a technological civilization elsewhere in the universe. The search has not produced a confirmed detection. The silence from the cosmos remains unbroken by any signal that the scientific community has accepted as artificial. And yet the search continues, funded, staffed and maintained by a species that cannot quite explain why it feels so certain that someone else is out there. The certainty is not scientific. No evidence supports it. It is instinctive, a conviction carried in the structure of human curiosity itself, as though the expectation of contact is older than the tools being used to pursue it. If humanity's ancestors included beings who travelled between worlds, then this instinct, the unshakable sense that the sky contains not just stars, but neighbours, might be less a product of imagination and more a residue of experience. Not a fantasy projected outward, but a memory projected forward. A species that once received visitors might carry buried deep in its cultural and cognitive architecture the expectation that visitation is possible, that the distances are crossable, that the silence is temporary rather than permanent. There is no way to confirm this from the evidence currently available. The instinct to look upward cannot be carbon dated. The feeling of cosmic familiarity cannot be sequenced from a genome. The emotional weight of the night sky cannot be excavated from a stratigraphic layer. These are soft traces and impression, left not in stone or clay, but in the way a species behaves, the stories it tells, the priorities it sets when allocating resources and attention. They do not constitute proof, but they constitute a pattern, and the pattern has remained stable for as long as humanity has recorded its own responses to the universe. It was there when the first temple was aligned with a star. It was there when the first myth described a teacher descending from the heavens. It is there now in the steady hum of radio telescopes pointed toward constellations whose names were given by people who believed those stars were not merely distant but familiar. And it will likely be there in whatever comes next when the story of humanity's relationship with the sky enters its next chapter, one shaped not by memory alone, but by the question of whether the wandering world at the centre of this ancient thread is still out there, still moving, still following its long and quiet orbit through the dark. The orbit that has not ended. One number keeps returning to the edges of this story, never quite arriving at the centre, but never drifting far enough away to be forgotten. In 2016, astronomers Konstantin Batygin and Michael Brown at the California Institute of Technology published a paper proposing the existence of a large undiscovered planet in the outer solar system. Their evidence was not observational. No telescope had captured an image of the object. It was mathematical. The orbits of a cluster of trans-Neptunian objects, small icy bodies drifting in the far reaches beyond Neptune, showed a statistical alignment that was difficult to explain without the gravitational influence of something massive and unseen. Batygin and Brown estimated the object's mass at roughly 5 to 10 times that of Earth, with an orbital period between 10,000 and 20,000 years. The planet, if it exists, would spend most of its time so far from the Sun that it would reflect almost no light, a dark body moving through a dark space detectable only by the subtle pull it exerts on the things around it. The scientific community received the hypothesis with cautious interest. It remains unconfirmed. No direct detection has been made, but the mathematics have not been refuted, and subsequent analyses have continued to find orbital anomalies in the outer solar system consistent with the presence of a large distant body on an elongated path around the Sun. This is not Nibiru. The hypothetical Planet 9 proposed by Batygin and Brown bears no direct connection to the Mesopotamian literary tradition, to Sitchin's interpretations, or to any ancient text. Its estimated orbital period is far longer than the 3,600-year cycle Sitchin attributed to Nibiru. Its estimated mass and position do not match the descriptions found in alternative history literature. The scientific hypothesis and the mythological concept occupy different categories of knowledge arrived at through different methods and answerable to different standards of evidence. Conflating them would be intellectually dishonest, and the distinction matters. But the coincidence, the quiet structural coincidence that modern astronomy has independently proposed the existence of a large unseen planet on a long elliptical orbit in the same solar system where the oldest human civilizations recorded stories of a wandering world that periodically approached the Sun, is the kind of detail that does not resolve neatly into either confirmation or dismissal. It sits where many of the details in this story sit, in a space between proof and pattern where neither certainty nor rejection feels entirely adequate. If such a world exists, not the Nibiru of myth, but a real planetary body moving through the outer darkness on an orbit measured in millennia, then the solar system contains something that humanity has not yet seen directly, but has perhaps been remembering indirectly for thousands of years. That possibility does not validate the ancient narratives. It does not confirm that beings once travelled from a distant world to shape the course of human development. It does not prove that gold was mined in southern Africa for atmospheric engineering, or that the Sumerian king list records the reigns of extraterrestrial administrators. It simply means that the structure of the solar system is not yet fully known, and that within the space of what remains unknown, the old stories have not been entirely excluded. This is not a comfortable conclusion for those who prefer clean answers. It offers neither the satisfaction of confirmation nor the closure of refutation. It leaves the thread intact, stretching from the clay prism in the Iraq Museum, through the aligned temples of Eridu and Uruk, through the carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe, through the shafts of the Great Pyramid pointing towards stars that have since moved, through the cell-fitted stones of Sacsayhuaman and the solar markers of Machu Picchu, through the ancient mines of southern Africa, through the linguistic architecture of Sumerian and Akkadian, through the creation narratives that describe clay-shaped and breath given Through the long silence that followed the departure of beings, the oldest civilizations describe not as imaginary, but as present. The thread does not lead to a final answer. It leads to a question that has survived every attempt to either prove or dismiss it. The question of whether humanity's deepest memory contains traces of a world it once called home. The sky tonight looks the same as it did when the builders of Eridu oriented their first temple toward a point above the horizon. The same stars turn in the same slow procession, shifted slightly by the millennia but still recognizable. Orion still rises in the east. Sirius still burns brighter than any other point of light in the night sky. The Pleiades still gather in their tight familiar cluster. And somewhere beyond the reach of every telescope currently operating in the cold space past Neptune and the Kuiper belt, the gravitational traces of something large and unseen continue to tug at the orbits of distant objects, pulling them into alignments that mathematics can describe, but observation has not yet confirmed. Whether that unseen body is the echo of a world remembered in the oldest human stories or simply another feature of a solar system far more complex than it appears from the surface of Earth is a question that remains open. The ancient narratives do not answer it. The modern data do not resolve it. What persists is the pattern, the convergence of myth and measurement of memory and mathematics, of the instinct to look upward, and the growing evidence that the darkness above contains more than emptiness. Humanity has always looked toward the sky with something deeper than curiosity. It has looked with recognition. And if the thread that runs through this story carries any truth at all, that recognition may not be the product of imagination. It may be the faintest trace of an origin that the species has spent 12,000 years of civilization trying to remember, and that the universe in its slow, patient way has not yet allowed it to fully forget. The clay prism is still there, behind its case in the Iraq Museum under glass that has been cleaned and replaced more times than anyone has bothered to count. The weld Blundell prism holds its columns of cuneiform in the same positions they occupied when a scribe in Lhasa pressed them into wet clay sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE. The cracks along its edge have not widened, the wedge marks have not softened. The names of kings whose reigns stretch across thousands of years remain legible to anyone trained to read them. The prism does not argue. It does not insist. It simply holds what was given to it, a record made by people who believed they were preserving something important, something they had received from a time before their own something they did not want the future to lose. Whether what they preserved was history or myth or something that lives in the space between the two, the prism does not say. It was not built to answer questions, it was built to carry them forward, and it has done so quietly for nearly 4,000 years. Tonight we followed those questions through temples aligned with stars that have since shifted through limestone pillars carved before agriculture existed, through shafts cut into pyramids to point toward constellations the builders would never see again from the surface of the earth. We followed them through stones fitted so precisely in the Andes that the method still resists full replication, through ancient mines whose dates precede the civilizations that are supposed to have needed them, through words in dead languages that describe the sky, not as a metaphor for the sacred, but as a direction, a place where someone once lived, and from which they travelled downward to the ground where we now stand. We followed them through creation narratives that share a formula clay and breath earth and essence across cultures that had no plausible way of exchanging such specific details. And we followed them to the edge of the solar system itself, where the mathematics of orbital mechanics suggest that something large and unseen continues to move through the cold space beyond Neptune, tugging gently at the paths of smaller objects the way a memory tugs at the edge of a thought you cannot quite complete. None of this resolves into a single clear image. It does not converge on a conclusion that can be stated plainly and defended without qualification. The traces are real, the alignment, the texts, the mining sites, the linguistic patterns, the cross-cultural parallels, but they are also incomplete. They are fragments of something that may have once been whole, scattered across 12,000 years of construction, migration, storytelling, and forgetting. History does this. It does not preserve events the way a photograph preserves a face. It preserves impressions, shapes worn smooth by the passage of time, details lost or transformed through each generation of retelling structures that survive only because stone lasts longer than speech. What reaches us is never the original. It is always the echo, and echoes are shaped as much by the spaces they pass through as by the sound that created them. If there is discomfort in that uncertainty, it is an honest discomfort. It means the questions are real. It means the evidence is strong enough to ask them, but not strong enough to close them. And perhaps that is where they belong. Not sealed inside an answer, but held open the way the prism holds its text, waiting for someone to look closely enough to read what is there without needing it to say more than it does. There is one question left, and it is small enough to carry without weight. If the sky tonight is the same sky that the builders of Eridu watched when they oriented their first temple, the same stars, the same slow turning, the same darkness between the points of light, then whatever they were looking for is still there. Not proven, not disproven. Simply present the way a distant landscape is present on the horizon, even when the air is too hazy to make out its details. The question is not whether they were right. The question is whether the direction that they pointed still holds something worth noticing. And that is a question you do not need to answer tonight. The night is wide enough for not knowing. The dark carries its own kind of comfort when you stop asking it to explain itself and simply let it settle around you the way it has settled around every generation of sleepers since the first human lay down beneath an open sky and felt without understanding why that the stars above were not strangers. Let your breath slow. Let the questions drift to wherever unanswered things go when the mind releases them. The temples, the stones, the prism, the shafts, the mines, the words in languages no one speaks anymore. They will still be there in the morning, patient as they have always been, for now there is only the quiet, only the dark, only the old familiar sky turning slowly overhead the way it has turned since long before anyone remembers keeping whatever it keeps in the silence between the stars. Rest well, traveller. The thread will hold until you're ready to follow it again.